Hello, I'm Hugh Adlington. I'm Professor of English at the University of Birmingham, and today I'm very glad to be at Wadham College, Oxford, to share with you a book from Wadham's wonderful collection of early printed works and manuscripts. The volume is a collected works of the Roman poet Horace, printed in 1562 in Venice in folio format. The cost and size and careful printing of folio made it the 16th century's most prestigious format, reflecting the cultural weight and value attached to Horace and other Roman and Greek authors. This particular edition was first published in 1544 and was very popular. It went through numerous reprints over the next couple of decades, until this 8th reprint in 1562. The copy that we have here there are other copies found in libraries in Europe and North America, so it's not extremely rare, but what makes it particularly fascinating is the evidence of ownership by the famous 17th century English poet and preacher John Donne. So I would like to take you into the book. Just before doing so, also a word about the binding, which is an 18th century binding, and so not original to the 16th century edition. But the appeal of this book isn't its exterior appearance, it's what's inside. So let's go inside. What we see on the inside front cover is the book plate and ownership inscription of 18th century botanist, lawyer, literary scholar Richard Warner, who bequeathed this volume to Wadham in 1775. You'll notice as we look at Warner's ownership inscription in the top left-hand corner, the date he's written there, 1733, and that's notable because Warner entered Wadham as an undergraduate in 1730 and graduated Bachelor of Arts in 1734. So what this date is telling us is that he seems to have first owned the book as a student at Oxford, and that's entirely commensurate with the nature of this book, which is intended as a volume for study. It contains the works of Horace, accompanied by Latin commentaries by various commentators. You can also see on the inside front cover here various shelf marks, some of them cancelled, as the book was placed in different locations in Wadham College Library over the years, and what also appears to be the strange fraction symbol here, a bookseller's code. Now, if we turn from this information about how the volume came to be in Wadham College Library more than 250 years ago, to the title page, the very handsome title page, we can see that it contains, as most printed books of this period did, all the information you need to understand who the work is by and what it contains. We can see here, obviously, Horace's name, his full name, Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Poetae Venacini, poet of Venosa, Horace's hometown in southern Italy. Then, underneath the name of the author, Omnia Poemata cum ratione carminum, all the poems with explanations of the poems or songs, indicating that this is an annotated edition with commentaries. And we then have a long list of the host of Renaissance humanist commentators, grammarians, rhetoricians, whose commentaries populate the pages of the book, together with two scholiasts from late antiquity, so-called Pseudo-Acro and Pomponius Porphyrio. That makes up the first part of the title page. Underneath that, we have information about the printer and where and when the book was printed. The book was printed by Giovanni Maria Bonelli in Venice in 1562. And we can see here the printer's device, which pictures an emblem of Minerva, Roman god of wisdom, with a shield, a spear, a helmet, riding a lion. And then we have Bonelli's motto surrounding the device, Virtuti omnia parent, roughly translated as all things answer to virtue. And so I think what we can see from this title page is that it speaks to the prestige and the authority of Horace as an author in the 16th century, and even to the educational and moral purposes for the book. Now, what you will also be able to see on the title page are the marks that are evidence of John Donne's ownership. And if we look first down in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see the traces or the remains of John Donne's signature. Just enough is left by the 18th century binder who trimmed the pages when rebinding the work of Donne's initial J, followed by D-O-N. And this is entirely consistent with the signature that Donne wrote in all of the books that he owned that survived from his library. And the placement is also exactly as we would expect to find it in the bottom right-hand corner of the title page. And I think if we were in any doubt that this was Donne's signature and that the book had belonged to Donne, that doubt would be dispelled when we look up at the top of the title page and see inscribed in the top right-hand corner Donne's Italian motto, Per Rachel ho servito e non per Leia, I serve for Rachel and not for Leia, which Donne wrote in all his books that he owned and in this particular position at the top of the page. And Donne took this line from the Italian poet Petrarch, who had himself taken it from the Bible, from Genesis chapter 29. Genesis tells us that the Hebrew patriarch Jacob fell in love with Rachel, the younger daughter of Laban, and effectively did a deal with Laban where he would work or serve for Laban for 7 years in return for Rachel's hand in marriage. After the 7 years were up, Laban deceived Jacob, switching Rachel for her older sister Leah under the cover of a bridal veil. And these words then, I serve for Rachel, not for Leah, are Jacob's complaint to Laban about that deceit, that he'd been duped. And one might well wonder, why would Donne take these words for a motto to include in his books, until we understand that in medieval symbolism, Rachel represented the contemplative life and Leah the active life. And so it seems that by including this line in his books, Donne was implying that although life had forced upon him a life of action, of business, of everyday affairs, his real preference lay in a life of study and contemplation. And that seems a reasonable enough sentiment to inscribe in one's books. So why is it interesting that Donne owned this book? Well, the answer is that of the 300 or so books that we have, or almost 300 books that we have surviving from Donne's library, almost none of them have anything to do with poetry or imaginative writing. The vast majority are concerned with topics such as divinity, religious controversy, law, statecraft, all things that were important to Donne in his career as a writer on religious controversy, and then later as an ordained minister in the Church of England. But it is striking that for one of the greatest writers we have of love lyrics, that there are so few works of poetry or literature surviving from his library. And so this work on Horace is interesting for that reason. And in fact, it's one of only three, alongside Donne's copy of an Italian edition of Virgil and an edition of Ovid in Latin, that Donne owned, or that we know Donne owned, of classical authors, by classical authors. The evidence that Donne was influenced by Horace, or that Horace mattered to Donne, is everywhere in his writing, particularly in his satires and verse epistles. And John Dryden, later in the 17th century, who was very critical of Donne's rough versification, declared that Donne, for so close following Horace, would fall with him. That is, in his style of writing, for not being smooth or mellifluous enough. And there is evidence, as I say, everywhere of the influence of Horace in Donne's writing. And in his sermons preached at St Paul's Cathedral, in the Royal Court, and other pulpits in London and elsewhere, Donne makes more reference to Horace than to any other classical author, including Virgil. So Horace clearly mattered to Donne, and this volume is tangible evidence of that connection. Now, we know then that Donne owned the book. The next question that follows is there any evidence in the book of how Donne read his Horace? And I think the answer to that is there are various forms of evidence in that we have several different kinds of scribal marks in the book. There are pencil marks and there are ink marks and annotations in three kinds of ink: grey, black and brown. And I'd like, if I may, to turn to the pencil markings first. So I'm going to turn now to Horace's Odes, and we find these pencil markings predominantly clustered in the first 9 odes, in the so-called parade odes of Horace. And as you can see, they are very discreet, sloping dashes placed in the margin next to the text. You can see them here and here, quite closely clustered in certain parts of the text. And this is evidence that Donne, or whoever made these marks, but I think it's Donne, was an attentive and close reader of the text. The reason I think that it is Donne is because these kinds of pencil marks are wholly consistent with very similar pencil marks found in other books that we know were owned and marked by Donne. So I think we can be reasonably sure that these marks, as slight as they are, were made by Donne and not by another reader. What is interesting, though, is that if we just turn back to the poem itself, the ode itself, this is the second ode in Horace's Book 1 of Odes, to Augustus Caesar. This is the text of Horace's poem, the verse, and there are no marks in this section at all, no marks next to the verse. Where the marks come are in the Latin commentaries that follow. And you can see that the commentators, who they are, they're identified by their abbreviated names in the margin. So we have Anto here for Antonius Mancinelli, who was an Italian humanist, pedagogue, rhetorician, grammarian, and he produced editions of Cicero and Virgil, and his commentary of Horace was widely read. We also have, if I turn to this page, Acra here. Acra stands for acro or pseudo-acro, the scholiast I mentioned from late antiquity, followed by por here, so that is Porphyrio, Pomponius Porphyrio, pseudo-acro's contemporary, and lastly here Asen, short for Jodocus Badius Ascensius, who was a Flemish printer and grammarian. And it's in these four commentators where we find the pencil marks. And what the pattern of marks appears to show is done first reading Antonius Mancinelli for meter, technical matters of syllabic patterning and so on in Horace, and then turning to the other three commentators for anything not covered in Mancinelli. This is interesting because scholars have often speculated about the reasons or the causes for Donne adopting the metrical verse innovations that he does in his poetry, and the reasons that are usually suggested are the fashions of the day, Francis Bacon's emphasis on plain style, and Donne's own interest in producing a poetry that most closely mimics real speech and its rhythms, rather than something artificially metrical and harmonious. And I think all of these are germane, but what I think this book and the markings in pencil in the commentaries can add to that account is Donne very clearly closely studied the humanist expositors who were commentating on Horace's meter and stanzaic form, these technical matters, more so than anything to do with the thematic interest of the poems, which are concerned with many fascinating things: politics and war, love, death, wine, friendship, the gods, so on and so on. But Donne's interest seems to be technical, and I think that really helps to place him. His usual status is as a bold innovator in his verse style, and he is that. But this book connects him to a long tradition, a humanist one and a classical one, of thinking about the shape and the style of verse and meter. Aside from the pencil marks in the volume, there are, as I mentioned, some ink markings and annotations. Some of these are in different hands and in different coloured inks, and none of those hands are Donne's, and we can rule those out as having been made by Donne, and they're very occasional and slight corrections of a letter or a brief translation of a line, or a deletion and an interpolation of a title. But the really fascinating part of this book lies in Horace's famous Ars Poetica, or Art of Poetry, which in the 16th century was the authoritative text on the craft of poetry, written in hexameter verse as a letter to friends, advising fellow poets on the craft of poetry. If we look in the pages of Ars Poetica, we will see that there are abundant ink annotations You can see the kind of thing here in the margins. They're mostly citational in nature, picking out names and words from the text, presumably for later transcription into commonplace books, placeholders, just a way of digesting and understanding the text. They're not explanatory glosses or comments in their own right, but what they do show is really close and careful and attentive reading, presumably by a student of Horace, and going through with great care and diligence. The big question, of course, is whether these ink annotations are Donne's. And I think on that question the jury is still out. The arguments that might be made against are that some of the letter forms in the hand we see here and the numbers differ from samples of Donne's writing that we have from a little bit later in his life. And a second argument might be that we have very few books from Donne's library annotated in ink in this fashion, and certainly not with this density. On the other side, it might be reasonable to suppose that if this book does belong to an early stage in Donne's educational career, and he was reading Ars Poetica as a youth, perhaps in his period of study at Oxford in the 1580s, when he was extremely young, started at age 12, then those differences in hands might be explained by the differences in his age at this point, being very young, and the fact that he this is rather unique in the density of his ink annotation might also be explained by way of saying that this was a method of annotating and reading books that he used when young, but that in later years he moved away from. Without corroborating evidence of other books from this stage in Donne's life, it's impossible to say whether these are Donne's marks or not. It's certainly possible that the pencil marks in the odes that we saw earlier do belong to this early stage in Donne's career. There's no reason why they shouldn't. Whether he would have marked in pencil one section of the book and then annotated in ink another is a more difficult question to answer. And I think, as I say, in the absence of further evidence, we just don't know the answer to that. It's still fascinating, though, even if these annotations were not by Donne, to think that somebody who read so closely and so attentively was placing these ink annotations almost exclusively in the margins of the Latin commentaries by one commentator, Aulo Giano Parazio, who was an Italian pedagogue and humanist. And it is intriguing to speculate really on the influence that Parazio may have had on generations of students reading about the art of poetry in Horace, and how Parazio's commentary would have informed their thinking on that subject. So just to summarize, the value of this book, then, I think we can say without doubt, lies in the glimpse that it offers us of Donne's engagement with Horace, I think at a young age, possibly, as I say, at university, and his immersion in the Latin humanist commentaries that accompany Horace's text, particularly on technical matters of meter, syllabic patterning, stanzaic form, and thus the book really connects Donne with a longer tradition of thinking and commentating on verse form. I would just like to say in closing that I hope this short tour of this book has demonstrated how much physical books can still disclose, how much information they can still disclose through the visible evidence of past readers, and for that reason how important collections like Wadham's remain and will continue to be important in the future.